Edward Seaga was the Prime Minister of Jamaica. He won the 1980 election in a landslide. He was celebrated in Washington as a model for what the Reagan administration wanted to see in the Caribbean, a pro-American anti-communist leader who could pull Jamaica away from the leftward drift of the 1970s. He gave speeches at the United Nations. He met with heads of state. He was, by every formal measure, a statesman. He also attended the memorial of a man responsible for 1,400 murders and called him the protector of Kingston's poor. That man was Lester Lloyd Coke, known everywhere in West Kingston as Jim Brown, founder of the Shower Posi, the most feared Jamaican gang leader in American history, and the Don whose power, whose drugs, whose weapons, whose political immunity from the law flowed directly from the relationship between the Garrison communities of West Kingston and the politicians who needed those communities locked down and voting the right way on election day. This is not a story about one man who chose to become a criminal. It is a story about a political system that created criminals, armed them, protected them, and then stood at their funerals and called them champions. It is a story about Cold War geopolitics and American drug policy and Jamaican poverty, all colliding in a single neighborhood and producing something that killed people in cities across the United States for over a decade. And it is a story about a fire in a prison cell in Kingston, Jamaica, on February 23, 1992, that everyone who understood the stakes involved has always found remarkably convenient. Because Jim Brown was 2 days away from being flown to the United States to stand trial, and what he carried in his head about the connections between the Shower Posi and the Jamaica Labor Party could have destroyed careers and power structures that some very important people needed to survive, and the fire took care of that. But the organization he built did not die with him. February 23rd, 1992, Kingston, Jamaica, General Penitentiary. United States federal marshals had arrived at the prison 2 days earlier to take custody of Lester Lloyd Coke, known everywhere in West Kingston as Jim Brown, and transport him to the United States to stand trial for drug trafficking, racketeering, and murder. He had fought the extradition all the way to the British Privy Council, the court of last resort for Jamaica, and lost. The paperwork was done, the handcuffs were ready, the plane was waiting. That morning, a fire broke out in his cell. By the time it was over, Jim Brown was dead. He was somewhere in his mid-40s. The official cause was accidental. Nobody with any knowledge of Jamaica believed that for a single second, because here is what everyone understood. If Jim Brown had made it onto that plane and into an American courtroom, he would have had every reason in the world to talk. And what he knew about the connections between the Shower Posi, the Jamaica Labor Party, and the politicians who had given the gang its protection for over a decade could have destroyed careers and reputations and power structures that some very important people needed to survive. Jim Brown died in that cell, and the secrets he kept died with him, but the organization he built did not die. His son Christopher, known as Dudas, took over at 23 years old and ran the Shower Posi for another 18 years until his own extradition to New York in 2010, where a military-scale battle in the streets of Tivoli Gardens left at least 73 civilians dead before he surrendered. The legacy of Lester Lloyd Coke is still being measured in body counts. American authorities attributed over 1,400 murders to the Shower Posi during the years Jim Brown was at its helm. 1,400 in less than a decade. In cities across the United States, from Miami to New York to Kansas City to Philadelphia, wherever the Shower Posi planted its flag, the bodies followed. This is the story of how a boy from a cramped tenement yard in Kingston, Jamaica, grew into the most feared posse leader in American history, how a politician handed him power, how the drug trade made him rich, and how, in the end, the only thing that stopped him from facing American justice was a fire in a prison cell that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. To understand Jim Brown, you have to understand Tivoli Gardens. And to understand Tivoli Gardens, you have to understand what Jamaica was by the time Lester Coke came of age in it. Jamaica had been independent from Britain since 1962, but independence had not brought the prosperity that the independence movement promised. The island's economy was structured in a way that concentrated wealth in the hands of a very small group at the top and left the vast majority of the population with almost nothing. In Kingston's downtown neighborhoods, the poverty was so severe and so entrenched that author Lori Gunst, who spent years researching Jamaican gang culture for her book on the posses, later said the most persistent sound she remembered from Kingston's ghettos was children crying. Not music, not traffic, children crying in the heat and the hunger. Schooling typically ended at 14 or 15 for kids in those communities. Housing was desperate. Multiple families packed into single rooms, sharing one bathroom between an entire building. Getting food on a daily basis was not a given. Remittances from relatives abroad sometimes determined whether a family survived the week. That was the landscape. That was the starting point. And into it, the two major political parties, the Jamaica Labour Party and the People's National Party, introduced a layer of organized political violence that would define life in Kingston's Garrison communities for the next 4 decades. The Garrison communities were neighborhoods that had been built and controlled by specific political parties, packed with loyalists, fortified against the opposition, and fought over during every election cycle as if they were military objectives, because they essentially were. When the Jamaica Labour Party under Edward Seaga built Tivoli Gardens in the mid-1960s, it was presented as public housing for the poor. What it actually was a political stronghold, a garrison packed with JLP supporters, intended to anchor Seaga's control of West Kingston. The People's National Party under Michael Manley did the same thing in their areas, and the result was a city divided into hostile armed camps, where elections were not just political contests, but life and death struggles that killed hundreds of people every cycle. The men who ran those communities on behalf of the politicians were called Dons. A Don was the neighborhood's enforcer, its judge, its provider, and its protector all at once. He settled disputes. He made sure rents got paid. He got children into schools. He fed families when there was nothing else. And when an opposing party tried to move on the community, the Don was the man who organized the armed response. In exchange for all of that, the politician who controlled the garrison kept the Don insulated from law enforcement, kept money and resources flowing into the community, and maintained the protection that allowed the whole arrangement to function. This was the world that made Lester Lloyd Coke, and it was a world that by design had very little room for him to become anything other than what he became. Coke grew up in the Denham Town area of West Kingston, not far from Tivoli Gardens. As a teenager, he initially aligned with the People's National Party, the opposition. Then at 19 years old, he was shot 6 times in the chest during a political confrontation. His own comrades left him for dead. It was JLP-aligned doctors and community members from Tivoli Gardens who found him and saved his life. That experience, being abandoned by one side and rescued by the other, switched his political allegiance permanently. Lester Coke became a Jamaica Labour Party man, and he became the most loyal and the most violent Jamaica Labour Party man in West Kingston. He started working under Claudius Massip, who was the first Don Dada of Tivoli Gardens and the leader of the gang that was then called the Phoenix Gang. Massip was a genuine figure of authority in the community, known by Jamaicans as a community man, someone who provided for the neighborhood while also enforcing the political order that kept Seaga's West Kingston base intact. Coke learned the game under Massip, served as his enforcer, built his own reputation as someone who would not hesitate and would not back down, and waited. In February 1979, Claude Massip was killed in a shootout with police. The Phoenix Gang needed new leadership, and Lester Lloyd Coke, now calling himself Jim Brown after the American movie star he had admired since childhood, was ready to take it. He renamed the gang the Shower Posi. The name came from their reputation for showering enemies with gunfire. It also carried a connection to the JLP's election slogan. Either way, the name fit. These were men who did not fire one shot at a problem. They rained bullets on it until the problem was solved. Jim Brown brought in Vivian Blake as his co-founder and partner for the American operations. Blake was a completely different type. Educated, polished, the son of a man who had been involved in Jamaican politics going back to the 1930s. He had reportedly been offered a soccer scholarship to Columbia University and turned it down to go into the drug trade instead, where Jim Brown was the ghetto ruffian who led with violence and personal force. Blake had the connections and the social intelligence to move in rooms that Jim Brown could not access. Together, they built something that had not existed before in the Jamaican underworld, an actual organized criminal enterprise with a vertical hierarchy, a centralized leadership, and operations that stretched across two countries. The 1980 Jamaican general election was, as writer Laurie Gunst would later describe it, a bloodbath. As many as 1,000 people were killed during the campaign. The level of political violence was unlike anything Jamaica had ever seen before. Gunmen from both sides moved through Kingston's Garrison communities with weapons that had been supplied directly or indirectly by political patrons with connections to foreign governments. The United States, under Ronald Reagan's administration, was deeply invested in seeing Seaga and the JLP defeat Manley and the PNP, which the CIA had assessed as dangerously sympathetic to Cuba and the Soviet Union. Multiple declassified documents would later confirm that American intelligence operations in Jamaica were designed to undermine Manley's government and support the opposition. When the election was over and Seaga won by a massive margin, the men who had done the most violent work on his behalf were owed a debt. Jim Brown was at the top of that list. He emerged from the 1980 election as the unchallenged Don of Tivoli Gardens, with what amounted to diplomatic immunity, protected by his relationship with the new Prime Minister. He could shuttle back and forth between Kingston and Miami using his connections. He could walk away from things that would have put any ordinary man in a Jamaican prison for the rest of his life. And he used that freedom to start building the American operation that would make the Shower Posi the most feared Jamaican gang in United States history. The timing was perfect, and Jim Brown understood that better than anyone around him. Ronald Reagan's war on drugs had included a marijuana eradication program in Jamaica, backed with American military and USAID funding, that was destroying acres of cannabis crops across the island. Marijuana was Jamaica's primary cash crop, the engine of the informal economy in the rural areas. And when those crops started burning, the traffickers who had been moving ganja needed a new product and new routes. At the same time, crack cocaine was beginning to explode in American cities, creating a demand so enormous and so profitable that the Colombian cartels were looking for reliable street-level distribution networks that could reach across the country efficiently. It is widely reported that the Cali cartel specifically identified the Shower Posi as their preferred street-level partners in the United States. Whether that account is precisely accurate or slightly embellished in the retelling, the underlying reality is documented. The Shower Posi became a major distribution arm for Colombian cocaine in multiple American cities, and they did it at exactly the moment when the crack epidemic was creating the most lucrative drug market in American history. Vivian Blake established the American operations, running cells in Miami, New York, Kansas City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and cities up and down the East Coast. The Shower Posi became the first Jamaican gang to branch out of New York City into New Jersey, building distribution networks in Newark, East Orange, Irvington, Camden, Atlantic City, Trenton, and Bridgeton. In Philadelphia, a Shower Posi cell was established in 1985. The operation was genuinely national in scope in a way that few street-level gangs had ever achieved. And Jim Brown ran Jamaica, while Blake ran the States. He was not a passive presence in Kingston. He was an active and expanding one. In May 1984, following a violent incursion from the neighboring community of Rama that posed a threat to Tivoli, Jim Brown led a reprisal raid in which 12 people were killed. A prosecutor's warrant was issued for his arrest, but nothing happened because Jim Brown was untouchable. Seaga's Jamaica meant the law did not lay its hands on the Don of Tivoli Gardens. So Jim Brown did what he always did after something that might have landed another man in prison. He got on a plane. He flew to Miami. In Miami in 1984, not long after his arrival, Jim Brown walked into a crack house and killed 5 people. One of them was a pregnant woman who knelt and prayed for her life before he shot her. Author Laurie Gunst, who interviewed sources familiar with the incident, described it plainly. This was the way you established dominance in the drug trade. This was how you made your name known on the street. You demonstrated in the most absolute possible way that you were willing to do what others were not. It worked, and it terrified law enforcement when they eventually pieced together what had happened. It worked, and it terrified law enforcement when they eventually pieced together what had happened, because it revealed that they were dealing with a category of criminal they had not fully encountered before. The Jamaican posses, and the Shower Posi in particular, operated by different rules than the organized crime groups that American law enforcement was accustomed to. The Italian mafia had its omerta, its code of silence, its rules about not killing law enforcement. The Shower Posi did not observe those rules. They were willing to kill police officers. They were willing to kill bystanders. They were willing to commit mass murder in a Miami crack house to establish a reputation. They had grown up in Kingston, where the police force itself was responsible for committing between 1/3 and 1/2 of the island's homicides in some years, so they carried absolutely no deference to law enforcement whatsoever. Jim Brown was arrested by U.S. immigration authorities after the 1984 Miami killings and deported back to Jamaica. In Jamaica, the predictable happened. Charges evaporated. He was free. He kept shuttling back and forth between Kingston and Miami on various passports and under various aliases for the next 2 years. In 1986, he murdered a minibus driver in Jamaica, and that case, unlike the others, actually made it to trial because the posse violence had by then become so extreme and so public that even Jamaica's untouchables were being brought in front of a judge. He was acquitted. On the day of the acquittal, his Shower Posi supporters crowded the streets in front of the Jamaican Supreme Court and fired their guns into the air to celebrate. On the American side, the Shower Posi's expansion through the late 1980s was documented by an increasingly alarmed law enforcement community that was struggling to understand what it was dealing with. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was the first federal agency to recognize the scope of the posse presence, not through drug investigations, but through firearms trafficking. The Shower Posi had become expert at buying weapons in Ohio, Virginia, and West Virginia, where gun laws were looser, and running them by car to New York and other cities where they were needed for operations, and they were also shipping weapons back to Jamaica. In 1984, a shipment of high-powered firearms sent from the United States to Kingston was intercepted when the person supposed to claim the barrels never showed up. When authorities opened the barrels and found the weapons, Interpol was called in for the first time. The guns were traced back to homicides committed in the United States, and suddenly the international scope of what the Shower Posi was building became visible to law enforcement agencies that had previously been operating in separate silos with no shared intelligence. The ATF reached out to the DEA. The FBI started building files. The Metro-Dade Police and the New York City Police Department began comparing notes. And for perhaps the first time in the long history of interagency rivalry that had hamstrung American law enforcement for decades, the agencies involved in trying to understand and dismantle the posse structure agreed to put their institutional competition aside and work together. They understood that what they were looking at required the combined resources of every agency involved. The body count attributed to the Shower Posi kept climbing. In March 1985, posse members opened fire on 300 reggae dancers at a dance in Fort Lauderdale, killing 1 man and wounding 3 others. In July 1985, a 6-year-old Miami girl on her way to buy an ice cream cone was killed in a gunfight between rival posses. The violence was not confined to criminals. It reached into the community in ways that the cocaine cowboys of the early 1980s had never quite achieved. The RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, finally gave federal prosecutors the tool they needed to attack the Shower Posi as a unified criminal enterprise. In 1988, a 62-count indictment was filed against 34 members of the Shower Posi by the ATF for RICO violations. In 1990, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Lester Koch and other key gang members on drug trafficking and murder charges. Jamaican authorities arrested them. On December 6, 1990, a coordinated operation run out of the FBI's New York office, in conjunction with the NYPD, the ATF, the State Department, Immigration Services, and numerous state and local agencies, simultaneously executed 32 search warrants across Brooklyn, Albany, Long Island, and Dallas. Automatic weapons, large amounts of marijuana, cocaine, and heroin were seized. Multiple posse members were taken into federal custody. The message was unambiguous. Jim Brown fought the extradition from a Jamaican prison cell for 2 years. He appealed all the way to the British Privy Council. In 1992, that court denied his final appeal. He was going to the United States, and everyone who knew what he knew understood what that meant. On February 23, 1992, the fire started in his cell at Kingston's General Penitentiary. By the time it was out, Lester Lloyd Coke was dead. The official story was accidental. Nobody who understood the stakes involved in Jim Brown talking to American prosecutors ever found that explanation fully satisfying. What he carried in his head, the connections between the Shower Posi and Edward Seaga and the JLP, the ways the political establishment had protected and enabled a criminal organization for over a decade, what he knew about the arms shipments and the drug routes, and the people on both sides of the law who had benefited from the arrangement, all of that died with him in that cell. Former Prime Minister Edward Seaga, the politician who had given Jim Brown his power and his protection for over a decade, spoke at his memorial and called him the protector of Kingston's poor. Thousands of mourners attended what looked to anyone watching from the outside remarkably like a state funeral. The institution Lester Lloyd Coke had built did not die with him. His son Christopher, 23 years old, stepped into the role of Don of Tivoli Gardens and head of the Shower Posi. Dudas Coke would run that operation for another 18 years, and he would be, in many ways, more sophisticated and more business-oriented than his father. He diversified into lottery scams and digital extortion. He preferred business to open war. He built an even deeper relationship with the community of Tivoli, handing out food and school supplies and running free concerts with Jamaica's top reggae artists, building a personality cult that made him effectively untouchable for nearly 2 decades. When the United States finally demanded his extradition in 2009, the Jamaican government initially resisted. The Prime Minister of Jamaica at the time, Bruce Golding, was the member of parliament for the district that included Tivoli Gardens. He had his own reasons to want Dudas to stay in Jamaica. The public pressure became impossible to withstand. In May 2010, the Jamaican government authorized an arrest warrant. What followed was the largest mobilization of the Jamaican military in the country's history. Tivoli Gardens had been fortified against exactly this kind of assault, with sandbag roadblocks, Alaska, 47 armed sentries at every entrance, snipers on rooftops, and Molotov cocktail factories positioned throughout the neighborhood to supply the gunmen defending it. Soldiers moved 200 meters in 2 hours. At least 73 civilians were killed. Dudas himself, when they finally captured him on June 22nd, was found at a roadblock outside Kingston trying to surrender to the American embassy. He was wearing a woman's wig and women's sunglasses as a disguise. He pleaded guilty in a New York federal court in August 2011 to racketeering conspiracy and weapons trafficking and received a 23-year sentence. The story of Lester Jim Brown Coke sits at the intersection of poverty, politics, Cold War geopolitics, and the global drug trade in a way that almost no other criminal story does. This was not just a man who chose to sell drugs. This was a man who was handed power by a politician in exchange for political violence, who was protected by that politician for over a decade, whose gang was armed, at least in part, by American intelligence interests seeking to keep Jamaica out of the Soviet orbit, who then parlayed all of that political protection and those government-level connections into one of the most devastating drug trafficking networks in American history. The 1,400 murders attributed to the Shower Posi during Jim Brown's years at the top did not happen in a vacuum. They happened inside a system that the Jamaican political class had helped create, that American Cold War policy had helped arm, and that the international drug trade had helped fund. The poor of Tivoli Gardens, the people who adored Jim Brown and mourned him like a hero when he died, were not wrong that he had done things for them that no government ever had. He kept the lights on in the neighborhood. He made sure children had school fees. He was there when Hurricane Gilbert hit in 1988, and the Jamaican government, crippled by IMF debt conditions, failed to distribute the foreign aid that had been sent to help rebuild. The posse had hard currency. The posse rebuilt communities. That is why the people of Tivoli called him a champion. That is why Edward Seaga called him a protector. And all of that is also true at the same time as 1,400 murders. All of it sits in the same story. The Robin Hood who showers rivals with bullets is still showering rivals with bullets. The man who paid children's school fees also walked into a Miami crack house and executed 5 people, including a pregnant woman who was on her knees begging. Both things are true. The tragedy of Jim Brown's story is not just his death in a prison cell fire. It is that the conditions that made him necessary to the people of Tivoli Gardens were not created by Jim Brown, and they were not going to be fixed by Jim Brown's death. They were created by a political system that used poverty as a tool, by politicians who handed guns to gangsters to win elections, by a global economic order that left countries like Jamaica without the resources to provide basic services to their own people, and by an American drug war that eradicated Jamaica's cash crop and drove its criminal class directly into the cocaine trade. Lester Coke was the product of all of those forces acting simultaneously. He was extraordinarily talented at what he did. He was also catastrophically violent and responsible for the deaths of an almost incomprehensible number of people. The fire that killed him in Kingston in February 1992 burned away any chance of the full story ever being told in a courtroom. What remains is the legend, the 1,400 dead, the son who followed him and the army that came for the son, the neighborhood that still shows the bullet holes, and the name Jim Brown, which is still spoken with a combination of reverence and fear in the streets of West Kingston, where everything that happened began and where nothing that happened has ever been fully reckoned with. The Shower Posi was built by politics, it was armed by politics, it was protected by politics, and it survived long after the man who founded it died in a cell fire that nobody has ever convincingly explained, because the conditions that made it necessary were still there when the smoke cleared. They are still there now. The posse did not hold together the way the Italian mafia held together, through a codified omerta, a generations-old code of silence backed by tradition and ritual. Jamaican organized crime, as one ATF agent who worked the posse investigations put it, did not have that kind of bond. When American law enforcement arrested posse members, they often found men who were frightened and willing to cooperate in exchange for lighter sentences. They would, as one observer put it, sing operas for law enforcement about the operation. The knowledge of this made the Shower Posse's task harder in one sense. They could not rely on loyalty alone to keep their network intact. So they built something else in place of loyalty. They built fear, not ordinary background level fear, extreme, immediate, demonstrated through action fear. The willingness to walk into a crack house and kill 5 people, including a pregnant woman. The willingness to open fire on 300 people at a reggae dance in Fort Lauderdale because a rival was somewhere in the crowd. The willingness to shoot a 6-year-old girl who happened to be walking to buy ice cream in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong moment. Every one of those acts of violence was also a message that said, this organization will do what no other organization is willing to do. And if you talk to law enforcement, or if you compete with us in our territory, or if you fail to pay what you owe us, we will do it to you too. That calculation worked for most of a decade. It kept witnesses quiet. It kept rivals out of Shower Posse territory in city after city across the United States. It made the gang's reputation precede them in ways that reduced the need for actual violence in some markets, because the threat alone was credible enough to produce compliance. You do not need to shoot everyone if everyone already believes you will shoot anyone. The crack cocaine trade gave all of this a financial engine of extraordinary power. Before crack, the Shower Posse was operating with marijuana, which was bulky, lower margin, and increasingly difficult to move out of Jamaica after Reagan's eradication programs. Crack cocaine changed the math entirely. The profit margins were enormous. A kilo of powder could be cooked into crack and sold at street level for multiples of what the powder had cost. The demand was, through the late 1980s and early 1990s, essentially infinite. And the Shower Posse had the distribution infrastructure across multiple American cities, the supplier relationships with the Colombian cartels, and the violent reputation to hold their territory against competitors. All of those things together made them, during Jim Brown's years at the top, one of the most profitable criminal organizations operating in the United States. The money created its own problems. As the Shower Posse grew and the cash flows increased, the people at the bottom of the vertical structure began to ask why they were taking all of the risk while the men at the top collected the majority of the rewards. Splinter groups started to form. Members relocated and tried to establish their own independent operations. Internal disputes turned violent in ways that consumed energy and manpower. A large, centralized organization under a single leadership has certain advantages, but those advantages erode when the money involved is large enough to make independence look attractive to men who already know how the operation works and already have the relationships to replicate it on a smaller scale. Jim Brown navigated all of those pressures for over a decade, from the Phoenix Gang through the Shower Posi's peak years, through the beginning of the American federal crackdown, right up to the prison cell in Kingston where it ended. That is an extraordinarily long run for a man who operated at the level of violence he operated at, in the political environment he operated in, with the number of law enforcement agencies actively trying to bring him down. His survival for as long as he did was not luck. It was a combination of the protection that Seaga's political establishment provided, the genuine fear his reputation produced in witnesses and competitors alike, the operational intelligence that kept him one step ahead of investigators who were often working without the interagency coordination that would eventually become standard practice, and the willingness to simply disappear when the heat got too intense. And the whole story is the only version that makes any sense of what happened and why it mattered, and why the name Jim Brown is still spoken with something close to reverence in the streets of West Kingston 30 years after the fire. The Shower Posi outlasted him. It outlasted his son. It is still out there in some form, smaller and more fragmented than it was, but with roots that go all the way back to the tenement yards and the political violence and the hunger and the crack cocaine and the 1,400 dead. Those roots do not disappear just because the man who planted them is gone.